This is the Federal Mobility Policy Update with Paul Lewis from the Center for Transportation, Benito Perez from Transportation for America, Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, and Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. This week, the House Infrastructure and Transportation Committee reported out a reconciliation measure that included $10 billion for transit operations, tied transportation spending to climate, and so much more. What are the next steps as it navigates through the process, and what could it mean for cities and states? How could it be a win for climate if properly leveraged? And with all the potential new funding, we'll unpack why building rail transit in the United States costs so much and takes so long. All that and more on this week's edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update, where we're going to go over what's been happening on the Hill, in the Beltway, and out in your neighborhood. With us today to unpack all that's been happening over the summer and the last 2 weeks, we have Benito Perez from Transportation for America. Hi, Benito.
Good morning.
And we've got Paul Lewis from the Center for Transportation. Hi, Paul.
Morning, Darryl.
And as always, we have the esteemed Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative. Hi, Martha.
Morning.
So let's start like we always start with what are the quick hits that you need to know, and then we'll go into unpacking that. We'll start with Benito. What has been happening? I know there have been a series of hearings this week. What should we be paying attention to?
Thank you, Darryl. So this week, earlier this week on Tuesday, September 14th, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee was marking up their portion of the reconciliation bill. They had $60 billion to program. Key things to highlight there is $10 billion towards transit, with specific ties into access connections to housing, education, medical services, and fresh food access. There was $4 billion also targeted towards transportation equity, key things on mitigating environmental and human impacts to the transportation system, creating affordable, walkable, safe connections, and capacity building in the community, focusing on assessing equity, air quality, but also public participation enhancements. And lastly, there was $4 billion towards climate change. And out of that $4 billion, $1 billion was targeted towards greenhouse gas performance measures and incentives and disincentives, plus $3 billion towards non-state government entities for carbon reduction projects.
So those are some good quick hits. There's a lot to unpack there. Let's turn a little bit to Paul. Paul, you've been looking a little bit at this in the longer term. Give us your take. What are your 3 quick hits or 2 quick hits?
Yeah, thanks, Darryl. What we're looking at right now in DC is a lot of money, and we've been following it very closely, not only in the bipartisan infrastructure plan, but also in the reconciliation bill. And throwing around $1 billion like it's nothing. And we think that this really could be a huge win for climate. There's a lot of ways to leverage this money to have environmentally beneficial projects, and so we're trying to find ways to make that happen. And then also we're looking at ways that we can take what we have and build more, especially for public transit. We've got a problem in this country where transit projects take too long and they cost too much. And so we've done a lot of research over the past 12 months looking at that issue and how we can get more bang for our buck. That's
great. So let's unpack all of that. Let's unpack, first of all, a little bit more of the detail, Benito, around the hearing. I had a chance to watch some of the hearing. It was impressive to the degree that once again, Peter DeFazio, the chair of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, was really pushing to keep that $10 billion for transit, which was originally part of the agreement in the Senate, back in. It was clever how he was able to do that to ensure that it doesn't violate the terms of the BIF. What else did you notice in going forward with this measure? And also, so what now, right? Now we know after a long hearing, we've got a package that relates to transportation. Where does it go from here?
Thank you. So it was very clever of Chairman DeFazio on how he navigated some of these issues on trying to ensure these investments get in. Regarding the transit, it's tying in close to home that, constantly transit needs to provide connections to affordable housing, and and also not only affordable housing, but also to employment, to education opportunities, to healthcare, and also a key thing that has been missing also is fresh food access. A lot of folks that are dependent on transportation don't always have the connections to those respective services. So he was very clever in putting those key requirements in, that this 10 billion is for public transportation to provide connection to that. Where do we go from here? So the committees, as of yesterday, should have that was their self-imposed deadline of getting their portion of the reconciliation complete. So now they will be cobbling it together towards what will be called the Build Back Better Act. That's the name for the budget reconciliation package. The Senate will also be deliberating and putting their portion of reconciliation, because they also have responsibilities. But the thing is, we'll have to watch and see key players such as Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and other senators that are up for re-election in 2022 on their take on this complete package as a whole, or where there are going to be cuts to allow this to pass both chambers.
So, Benito, just for those of us that aren't really steeped in Congress right now, the House is going to vote on their version of the bill. And then does the Senate consider that version, or what does that process look like?
So the respective committees that have responsibilities on the House are turning their portion into the House Ways and Means Committee, because that's the Finance Committee for the House. The Senate respective committees are turning it over to the Senate Finance Committee, which then will cobble together their respective portions and then pass over their portion to the other side for approval, and then be sent to the president's desk from there. The goal right now is from House and Senate leadership is to push this by the end of this month, September 27th, because as you may or may not know, in the House, in order to push for reconciliation, there had to be an agreement for more moderate Democrats to allow a vote of the BIF, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, by the 27th. And the key demand from the House was they want reconciliation if they want the infrastructure bill to pass. So right now, it's a tight deadline, a lot going on. So it's going to be all eyes on what's going to happen in the Senate, again, with those key players, ensuring that we can meet that deadline.
So there will be a vote in the House and in the Senate on the same bill, theoretically, by September 27th.
Correct.
And we know that the House has done its homework previously this year and done a really good job of detailing out the needs that have moved forward. The Senate, not so much. Is there a danger that the Senate will water down the good things that the House has put in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee put in?
That is a threat, especially from key players who don't like the top line number. And it's going to be, and what we're waiting to see is what specifically are they looking to cut? So is it going to be wholesale cuts in specific aspects of transportation? Because there's some discussions on the Hill, like, well, some of this was already accounted for in the infrastructure bill, so why are we putting more money in reconciliation? So it's under threat of being on the chopping block, especially if some of these key players in the Senate really put their weight towards this position. Okay. So it's something for advocates to keep a close eye and communicate with their Senate representatives and House representatives to ensure those things stay in place.
That's great.
The process.
So, Paul, we know that the initial word out on what was passed by the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee could look for good for climate if that's properly leveraged. Talk a little bit about that, about what needs to happen if we're lucky to have these measures passed.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, let's look at what's in the bipartisan infrastructure bill and in reconciliation. And we're talking at least $40 billion of new funding for public transit, $66 billion for intercity passenger rail and freight, a $6.4 billion carbon reduction program, and another $4.5 billion for biking and pedestrian facilities, $1 billion for reconnecting communities. Include some of the Department of Energy money. We're talking about somewhere around $90 billion for electric vehicles. The list kind of goes on. There's some real money there. But if we're going to take that money, and again, a lot of it is just money with some eligibility. What does it mean for climate? There's a lot of work to do. Bill is passed, right? And this is where we can focus on the criteria for selecting discretionary grants. So about $100 billion of this money is really in the sole discretion of the secretary, and Pete Buttigieg and his team are going to be able to make some decisions on what projects get funded and which projects don't. And so if they can target that criteria to ones that have benefits for the environment. We can also focus on operations, right? So yes, we can build a new Amtrak line, but if it serves one Amtrak train a day, it's not particularly useful. And so how do we take this and leverage the operations that happen after the infrastructure is built?
Yeah, I do like the focus on outcomes, performance measures around greenhouse gases, outcomes from transit spending that actually connect people to food and other things that they need, the access ideas. So that's pretty exciting. Paul, you had talked about spending the money wisely, and, we are fans of your new report. It's a mouthful, right? I had to write the title down: Saving Time and Making Sense. Thank you. Saving Time and Making Sense, a blueprint for building transit better, right? The deep dive into why major transit projects in this country cost so much money. It's a great report. I encourage everybody to read it. But Paul, why don't you give us a little, give us a brief high level view of what you all found in that report, and then we can dive deeper. I have some questions about what you found.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's a really interesting report. There's a lot going on in it. But this was something that some folks from the Merck Family Fund and a few others came to us about a year and a half ago and said, look, if we're going to be building transit, we have to get as much out of that dollar as we can. And there was this perception that turned out to be correct, that we weren't. The U.S. has some of the highest cost rail transit on the planet. And so for every dollar we spend, we get less out of it than all different kinds of countries. And so we looked into that in this report to understand how bad is the problem, where is this coming from, why is this the case, and what can we do about it. And so we put together a huge database. We talked to hundreds of folks all over the world about some of the lessons from other countries. And we put together a series of recommendations for both the federal level and the local level to address this problem head on. So
what'd you find?
So, in terms of the actual costs, when we first compared the US to Western Europe and Canada, just, from a political and cultural standpoint, the US has a lot of similarities to those countries. And we already have a big premium, at least 50% more to build the same infrastructure. If you include New York City, it's 250% more. If you include other countries like Chile or Japan or South Korea, that gets the cost differential gets even greater. So there's definitely a cost differential. There's definitely a time differential too, and time is money. But projects tend to take between 6 months to 2 years longer to build, not the planning and everything. So there is a specific problem. But the issue, of course, is multifaceted. It's not one specific thing. It's related to the governance of the projects and how we organize them and manage the project itself. It's related to the processes. What are the steps that we take to plan and execute and actually build them? And then there's an element here related to the standards. How are we building projects? How are we designing them? What are the standards to which we're building them? And there's some issues in there as well. So I'm happy to talk through. There's a lot in there. And like you said, the report is available for free download on our website. But there's a couple key things that I'm happy to talk through within those elements that I think are going to be really useful.
And we'll put the link in the show notes. I'd love to get a reaction from Benito. Benito's previous role was as part of the District of Columbia in their Department of Transportation. So he has lived some of the experience of transportation projects, recognizing that much of what you talked about, some of what you talked about is tunneling and heavy duty tunneling costs, as well as other big infrastructure costs. But Benito, does Is what Paul talking about resonate with you? Do you have any examples of how things often cost more, and it's not about the labor cost, but it is about the siting and process cost?
I'll do my best here.
Well, just your reaction from lived experience in the district, you know?
I can see that quite a bit. I mean, the District of Columbia just recently opened one of their second largest. It's their largest project, but it's the second of the list that they had, the Frederick Douglass Bridge, just earlier this month, multi-billion-dollar project. And yes, there's issues about labor, but there's also environmental permitting and mitigation efforts, but also the intense and managing community engagement and expectations that adds to the time and cost for these projects. But it's also important. But it's how do you balance those needs against cost and time?
Yeah. So, Paul, I was struck by, that one of the points they made in the report was that our state DOTs are building highways a lot. They are regularly building great, big, massive capital construction projects. Transit agencies, not so much. They are more focused on operations, and that one of your recommendations was to bring some of that expertise on delivering big highway projects more efficiently from the highway sector into the transit sector. I thought that was a really practical recommendation. It also seems like there's some cleanup and some work to be done just on getting everybody coordinated and moving together, and perhaps simplifying some of the requirements around these projects, because it does seem like, I don't know, the perception is that transit projects are more complicated. They're subject to more regulations than perhaps highway projects. I know like sidewalk projects are so complicated to use federal money for sidewalk projects that we sort of have this bias toward road building and figuring out how to move some of that efficiency into the transit sector. But what were your specific, some of the specific ideas you came up with in that space?
And looked at rail projects that were in the same corridor, and the institution itself, right? And I'm going to generalize here a little bit, but highway DOT was designed as an institution to build big projects. And that's what they've done for the past 50 years, and they've gotten really good at it. And so one of our recommendations is to share some of that experience with transit agencies. And, meanwhile, transit agencies were designed to operate the trains and buses that were already in existence, taking it over from the private sector in the 70s and 80s. And those institutions are operating agencies that once every decade or so we say, okay, go build a mega project, right? And they just don't have the in-house experience and capacity to do so. And so some of the things that we recommend, of course, are borrowing and leveraging some of that expertise, expanding the expertise at the Federal Transit Administration. They do a lot of good work, but don't have the same level of staffing and frankly are just not in the same places as some of these big transit projects. And also doing this in a way that's relying more on public sector expertise. Right? We have in this country a propensity to rely on consultants to manage projects. And consultants do really good work, and they have very refined expertise. But best practice abroad shows that if you have public management that's really managing and driving the project, it'll lead to better outcomes.
And I want to jump in on this because I'm now putting, my past experience on, and also looking at, spending quite a bit of time looking at U.S. code as it relates to the impacts of the infrastructure bill. The highway program's pretty doesn't have that much hoops to jump through. When you look at the transit program, it's like hoop after hoop after hoop, and there was some even provisions in the infrastructure bill. I'm like, how much more difficult are you trying to make this for transit? And that comment you just made, Paul, about consultants even resonate even more with me, because I just think about my experience at District DOT in the early years. It was like, I went to planning school and engineering school and, I have an engineering and planning degree. But then you get there and they're like, oh, we want you to be a project manager for this project and, lead the consultants to do X, Y, Z. And I'm like, I could do this. I can actually do the work. Let's, build the capacity in-house. Because, you build that institutional capacity, you can do more versus, putting off to a consultant, which only, has their specialized expertise, but to the local context, they just do the project and run, and go. But then that institutional knowledge is gone. You got to rebuild that institutional capacity again with each consultant versus building it in-house. It's something I would like to, but and this is also another challenge, a personal issue that I hopefully can see more attention put to is the workforce development. People may not know up to half of the public sector workforce is up for retirement here in the next 5 years. I look at the team that I was on, at least 2/3 of them are eligible for retirement in the next 3 years. And I was there panicking. I'm like, how am I as a manager going to retain this institutional knowledge and keep us going? I don't want to have to rely on consultants because then it's like, how to also build that local context. So facilitating capacity at DOTs and also now preparing for, this huge turnover. So how do we focus on workforce development in the years ahead to build on that, build on Paul's comments here?
So it feels like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's a really good point about workforce development. It also segues into my question about labor. I think there is a perception, perhaps, that the cost of labor, unions are a part of the problem with the high cost of projects. And I was actually, I'll admit, I was delighted to see that in your report that did not rise to the top as one of the issues, because our friends in the labor movement, I think, are doing really, really valuable work, and they are our allies in so much of this. So Paul, can you unpack a little bit about what you found about labor costs and where labor fits into the mix?
Yeah, and it's something I was also surprised to find, right? And the general finding is that there isn't a lot we can be doing on the labor front to really cut costs, right? And costs of workforce in the U.S. are higher for projects, in part because we have to carry the weight of pension plans and healthcare plans in ways that our European counterparts do not. But if you look at the case studies we had in our report, and this is Denver and Seattle and Minneapolis and Los Angeles, all places where they're doing a lot of building, nobody we talked to was like, yeah, we need to look at the union contract. We've got, too many work rules. We've got all this overtime. And nobody was saying that. They're saying, look, it's a competitive market. We're paying above prevailing wage because this is what, what the market is. And, our unions have been pretty cooperative. And so the issue in terms of workforce was not on the frontline workforce labor front, but more on the in-house professional staff that's putting together plans and environmental documents and managing the project. That's where we need to be focusing our attention in terms of workforce development, in terms of hiring the right people and restructuring some of the salary and other retention plans that we have at our public agencies.
It is, I just have one follow-up comment or question. It is interesting that, in these in European countries where they have socialized, healthcare and pensions and all of that, retirement, they're not burdening these individual projects with those costs, or they're not, individual projects like this are not being expected to carry as much of the burden of, what I think is really in the common good, sort of the working of a functioning society. So that's an interesting connection.
I feel like there's this fear, like amongst public sector about, building that institutional capacity because of those, extraneous, the overhead costs. But that cost is still being borne out, when you get consultants, but then they walk out the door with the institutional knowledge that the agency desperately needs. And I don't think, I've seen it with European and other international counterparts that they have that challenge. I think it's very short-sighted to look at it that way.
Yeah.
And I would say it's very important for public sector entities to start looking at how do you build capacity internally for the future. Because I think in the long run, you're going to cut costs that way. I mean, I think about, again, at DOT, and I'm thinking about like communications and like website development. When you have 5 or 6 different projects creating 5 or 6 different communication strategies and plans versus just having a dedicated public information team at an agency that's focused on knowing what's going on with all the projects, ensuring the synergies happening across the project. There's savings that it materializes there.
Is there anything, we probably shouldn't go too deep into that. That's a really great topic, though. I'm just wondering, is there, within this federal bill, the Build Back Better Act, is there anything that helps to tip the balance toward that, toward building more institutional capacity? Or is it fairly neutral on that idea? Because I agree with you. If you are just paying consultants, you're not building that bench that you need internally of leadership to run the agencies and make sure that the public money is being used well.
So there is some nod to it in reconciliation in the equity program, that talks about capacity building, not only in public sector, but also community-based organizations. Mm-hmm. But also, I would be remiss for not highlighting also in the infrastructure bill, there is a measure in there about states creating human capital plans to start looking, to assess like, where are they? Do they have the capacity at the state and the subdivision level to deliver on what is becoming a more robust, complex, demanding transportation system? Gone are the days of, just build things. Like there's issues about maintenance, operations, managing demand and supply. So I would say there's a step in the right direction in the infrastructure bill highlighting where are we at each individual state? Where are we from our human capital perspective? So it'd be interesting to see how states actually work on that.
It also feels like an opportunity to both diversify and localize the workforce that's working on this. I know, Paul, you talked a little bit about the need to have familiarity with what's on the ground. And I like the idea of centralizing communications so that it's all a message from an agency to the public, involving people from the public as part of the bureaucracy. And it feels that transportation is an area that funders can work on, diversifying the transportation availability by supporting younger people who are entering into the field and diversifying that field. That's an area that I think we in philanthropy can work on. Also, I think the report surfaces and kind of challenges preconceived notions of why do things cost much. It's not necessarily about labor. It's a set of other factors that philanthropy can help to further push out. Sadly, we have to push off, not push out. And let's close this as we always do with a question that is not related to transportation. So this week's question is, what did you do this summer? Where did you go for vacation, if anywhere at all? We'll start with Benito.
Actually, if I could go back just a little bit real
quick. Sure, go back.
Where philanthropy could help. A lot of public entities are dealing with strapped budgets. And then you think about, the future generation of planners, engineers, professionals in the transportation industry, looking for opportunities, and then opportunities partnering with a public sector agency. Maybe it's like a fellowship to provide a paid internship opportunity that helps the agency. It helps build a talent pool for the future. Because again, as I noted earlier, you're talking about half the workforce across various levels of government are retiring. So if that's something that you can help in your local community, sponsoring a fellowship with an agency to build that capacity, that would be, on behalf of my colleagues, when I was in the public sector, that would be a huge help. But to your question about summer vacation, I did spend some time near Ernest Hemingway's home there in Key West, Florida last month, and out to wine country next week in California.
Good for you. So you saw the cats. There's like multiple. There cats that have like 12 toes or something. You saw that.
I avoid the cats. I'm sorry. I watch from afar.
Okay. All right. Paul, what did you do this summer?
Yeah, I mean, I spent the summer writing the report that everyone's going to read.
Okay.
But aside from that, no, we did. It was very nice to spend some time with family. I've got two little kids, and their grandparents were very eager to see them, especially now that everyone's been vaccinated, and we were able to spend a lot of time just relaxing with family here and elsewhere around the country.
That's great. Martha, where did you go for vacation?
Best was rafting and stand-up paddleboarding on the Colorado River.
Great.
Pretty delightful.
Great. I got away to the Navajo Nation and visited Canyon de Chelly and Chaco Canyon and recognized that there is a definite need for rural transportation between a whole set of areas that are disconnected only if you have a car or if you don't have a car. We're going to have to head out. Thank you for watching our show. We'll put more information in the show notes. If you like this broadcast, like it, we'll be back within a week to 2 weeks to further update you on what's happening on the Hill, in the Beltway, and in your neighborhood. Thanks for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.